On a frozen morning in early November 1944, deep inside Germany's Hurtgen forest, a column of American soldiers stumbled down a narrow goat track into a ravine so steep that the men ahead vanished from sight within seconds. Artillery shells burst in the treetops above them, turning every branch into a spray of white-hot splinters. Somewhere below, the Kall River ran cold and shallow over mossy stones, and on the far bank the Germans waited in prepared positions with machine guns sighted on the only crossing for miles. No sane commander would have sent tanks down that trail. No reasonable plan would have staked an entire division's success on a path barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Yet the gruesome mathematics of the Hurtgen forest left no alternatives. The 28th Infantry Division had been ordered to cross the Kall, seize the towns of Kommerscheidt and Schmidt on the ridge beyond, and hold them against whatever the Germans threw back. What happened over the next 9 days would produce one of the most disastrous American operations of the entire Second World War. But buried inside that disaster was a story so unlikely that the men who witnessed it could barely explain it afterward. American medics, unarmed, wearing nothing but Red Cross armbands and helmets daubed with white paint, walked straight into German lines to retrieve their wounded. And the Germans, who had been killing everything that moved on the Kall Trail for days, stopped shooting. Some of them set down their rifles, picked up American stretchers, and helped carry the casualties to safety. A German doctor proposed a ceasefire. For parts of 5 days, in the middle of one of the bloodiest battles of the war, enemies worked side by side to save lives. This is the verified, documented account of what happened in the Kall Gorge, and why it mattered. The Hurtgen forest sits along the German-Belgian border southeast of the city of Aachen, a dense expanse of fir trees covering roughly 50 square miles of ridgelines, gorges, and narrow trails. The canopy is so thick that in places sunlight barely reaches the forest floor. The terrain rises and falls sharply, cut by streams that have carved deep ravines over thousands of years. In 1944, the forest floor was a tangle of roots, fallen timber, and mud that swallowed boots to the ankle. Fire breaks and logging tracks provided the only routes through it, and most of those were too narrow for vehicles. The Germans had fortified this terrain for months. They had pre-registered their artillery on every junction, every clearing, and every stretch of trail where vehicles might pass. They had laid thousands of anti-personnel mines, particularly the shoe mine, a small wooden box filled with just enough explosive to blow off a foot. They had strung tripwires between the trees and buried Teller anti-tank mines on every path wide enough for armor. The forest itself was a weapon, and the Germans had spent the autumn turning it into one of the most lethal defensive positions on the Western Front. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest became the longest single battle the United States Army has ever fought, running from September 19, 1944, to December 16 of the same year. It was also the longest battle waged on German soil during the entire war. Division after division was fed into the forest. The 9th Infantry Division went in first and lost roughly 4,500 men for a gain of about 3,000 yards. A ratio of casualties to ground gained that matched some of the worst fighting on the Western Front in the First World War. The 4th Infantry Division, the 8th Infantry Division, the 1st Infantry Division, the 2nd Ranger Battalion, and elements of the 5th Armoured, 7th Armoured, and 78th Infantry Divisions all fought there at various times. Total American casualties in the Hurtgen are estimated at 33,000, though some historians place the figure above 55,000 when non-battle casualties from trench foot, frostbite, and combat exhaustion are included. German losses were approximately 28,000. The strategic logic for attacking the forest remains debated to this day. The initial concern was to protect the southern flank of the drive toward Aachen, which fell to American forces on October 21, 1944, becoming the first German city captured by the Allies. Later, American commanders cited the Rohr River dams as the real objective, specifically the Schwammenau and Urft dams. If the Germans opened those dam gates while American forces were crossing the Rohr, the resulting flood would isolate any bridgehead on the far side. But the dams were not even mentioned in the original attack orders for the Hurtgen. Whatever the reasoning, the decision to fight through the forest rather than around it condemned thousands of men to a battle where every advantage belonged to the defender. The German defenders rotated fresh units into the forest throughout the autumn. The 275th Infantry Division, and the 353rd Infantry Division held the early line. The 89th Infantry Division, under Colonel Eberhard Rosler's 1056th Regiment, controlled the Kall sector, and the 116th Panzer Division, the elite Greyhound Division, was held in reserve to counterattack any American penetration. Above them all sat Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, one of the most capable defensive commanders in the German army, a man Hitler trusted to hold ground when others could not. Model understood that the forest itself was his greatest asset. He did not need to defeat the Americans in the open. He simply needed to bleed them in the trees. The Germans exploited the terrain with devastating efficiency. They used timed and impact-fused artillery shells that detonated in the treetops, a tactic called tree bursting. When a shell struck a branch 30 or 40 feet overhead, the explosion sent fragments downward in a cone of shrapnel that no foxhole could fully protect against. A soldier lying flat on the ground, which was the standard response to incoming artillery in open terrain, was actually more vulnerable to tree bursts than a man standing upright, because the fragments sprayed outward and down from the point of detonation. Across all four American armies during the November and December offensive, roughly 65% of wounded soldiers had been hit by shell, bomb, or grenade fragments. In the Hurtgen, where tree bursts dominated the fighting, the proportion was at least that high. The standard infantry foxhole, which provided excellent protection in open ground, became a death trap in the forest because it offered no overhead cover against fragments raining straight down. Men learned to pile logs over their holes, but German artillery could blast those away in minutes. A soldier of the 4th Division later described it in terms that captured the experience of every man who fought there. "You cannot find all of the dead because you cannot find them," he said. "The trees are slashed like a scythe by artillery. Everything is tangled. You can scarcely walk. Everybody is cold and wet. Then they jump off again, and soon there is only a handful of the old men left." Into this nightmare came the 28th Infantry Division, the Pennsylvania National Guard unit, known by its red keystone shoulder patch as the Keystone Division. The men of the 28th came from the coal towns and steel towns of Pennsylvania, from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, from Lancaster and Harrisburg. By the time they entered the Hurtgen, they had already fought their way across France. They had marched in a victory parade down the Champs-Élysées in Paris on August 29, 1944, before being sent straight back to the front. Their commander was Major General Norman D. Cotter, a Distinguished Service Cross recipient who had landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day and rallied pinned-down troops under fire. Cotter was a fighting general, a man who led from the front and expected his subordinates to do the same. But the orders he received from Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges at 1st Army and Major General Leonard Guerreau at the 5th Corps left him almost no room for maneuver. The plan was essentially the same one that had already failed for the 9th Infantry Division, which had been ground to pieces in the same forest weeks earlier. The plan called for Cotter's 3 regiments to attack in diverging directions, the exact opposite of the concentration of force that military doctrine demanded. The 109th Infantry would push north toward the town of Hurtgen. The 110th Infantry would advance south toward Rafflesbrand and Simonskol, and the 112th Infantry, commanded by Colonel Kall L. Peterson, would drive straight through the center, crossing the Kall Gorge to seize the villages of Wassenach, Kommerscheidt, and Schmidt. The 3 regiments would be moving away from each other as they advanced, unable to support one another. If any one of them ran into serious trouble, the others could not help. The Kall Trail was the lifeline of the entire operation, and it was barely a trail at all. It dropped off the eastern edge of the Wassenach Ridge, plunged roughly 500 feet down into the gorge, and crossed a small stone bridge near an old watermill called the Mestringer Mule, and climbed back up onto the Schmidt-Kommerscheidt Ridge on the far side. From the church spire in Wassenach to the village of Kommerscheidt was about 2 miles as the crow flies. But the trail itself was a winding, rock-strewn logging track where the right side hugged a steep wooded hillside and the left side dropped straight into the ravine below. At its most treacherous point, what American tankers later called the Rocky Outcropping, the trail was a few inches narrower than the 8-foot 7-inch hull width of a Sherman tank. One miscalculation by a driver, one moment of inattention, and a 33-ton tank would slide off the edge and tumble into the gorge. Astonishingly, no engineer reconnaissance of the trail was conducted before the attack began. No engineer unit was assigned in writing to secure the Kall crossing. The 20th Engineer Combat Battalion was given the mission of opening the trail for traffic, but they had never seen the ground they were supposed to improve. The division engineer, the corps engineer, and General Kota himself all approved a plan that staked an entire division's attack on a goat path that no one had walked beforehand. This failure of reconnaissance, documented in detail in the official army history, would haunt every man who fought on the Kall Trail. The soldiers who descended it for the first time on November 3rd could not believe what they were walking into. The path switched back and forth down the hillside at gradients steep enough that a man carrying a full pack had to brace himself with one hand against the hillside to keep from falling forward. The mud was ankle-deep in places, and the ruts from previous logging vehicles had filled with water that turned to ice overnight. In the dark, men slipped and tumbled into one another. Equipment clattered against rocks. Canteens and mess kits banged against rifle stocks. Any hope of a quiet approach was impossible. The Germans could hear the Americans coming from hundreds of yards away. The attack began on November 2nd, 1944, behind a 12,000-round artillery preparation. The 2nd Battalion of the 112th Infantry jumped off at 0900 hours toward Vossenac. By afternoon, they had taken the village against moderate resistance. The following day, November 3rd, Lieutenant Colonel Albert Flood's 3rd Battalion descended the Kall Trail, crossed the river, climbed the far slope, and seized the town of Schmidt itself with remarkably little opposition. The Germans had not expected the Americans to come through the gorge at all. Major Robert Hazlitt's 1st Battalion settled into Kommerscheidt, the village halfway between the river and Schmidt. For one brief evening, the situation map at division headquarters looked extraordinary. American troops held all three objectives. The Kall crossing seemed vindicated. It did not last 24 hours. At dawn on November 4th, the German 116th Panzer Division, known as the Greyhound Division and led by Oberst Siegfried von Waldenberg, struck Schmidt from two directions simultaneously. A force of Panzer IVs and Panthers attacked from the northeast out of the village of Harscheid, while a second armoured column came up from Strauch in the south. The 3rd Battalion in Schmidt had laid mines, but they were easily visible on the surface. They had no anti-tank guns positioned forward. Many of the riflemen were green replacements, fresh from training depots in the United States, young men who had received almost no preparation for combat in a forest against armoured vehicles. When the German tanks appeared in the morning fog, the battalion broke. Men fled westward toward the river. Some ran east in the confusion and were captured. By mid-morning, Schmidt was back in German hands, and it would not be retaken by the 28th Division. 8 Sherman tanks of Company A, 707th Tank Battalion, attempted to negotiate the Kall Trail to reinforce the battered defenders in Kommerscheidt. Only 3 made it through, a platoon under 1st Lieutenant Raymond Flagg, with engineers from the 20th Engineer Combat Battalion chipping rock with hand tools and explosives at the outcropping to widen the path by inches. A platoon of M10 tank destroyers under 1st Lieutenant Turney Leonard of Company C, 893rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, also crossed. Around noon on November 4th, a Sherman threw its track on the rocky outcropping and hung there like a steel wall, blocking the trail for 15 hours. No vehicle could pass in either direction. Supplies could not go forward. Wounded could not come back. General Kota sent a message to the task force commander. "The Kall Trail must be open by daybreak," he ordered. "If necessary, you will roll your immobilized tanks down the slope and into the draw." By the time the 28th Division was finally pulled off the line on November 13th, the toll was staggering. The division had suffered 6,184 casualties in less than 2 weeks. The 112th Infantry alone lost more than 2,000 men, roughly 3/4 of its assigned strength. Company A of the 707th Tank Battalion was effectively destroyed. Company C of the 893rd Tank Destroyer Battalion lost 11 of its M10s in the Kommerscheidt fighting alone. 1st Lieutenant Turney Leonard, who had directed the destruction of 6 German tanks before a high-explosive shell shattered his arm on November 6th, received the Medal of Honor posthumously. He was last seen alive at the battalion aid station. His body was not recovered until November 1949, found in a caved-in dugout near Kommerscheidt. His Texas A and M class ring was found by a German civilian named Alfred Hutmacher and returned decades later through his son-in-law. But this is not a story about the battle's catastrophic failures, though those failures created the conditions for what followed. This is a story about what happened in the gorge itself, among the wounded and the men who refused to leave them. The Hurtgen forest did not only kill men with bullets and shrapnel, it destroyed them with cold, with water, and with exhaustion. November 1944 brought freezing rain, sleet, and the first snows of winter. Men spent days in waterlogged foxholes without dry clothing, without hot food, without any prospect of relief. Trenchfoot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure of the feet to cold and moisture, disabled hundreds of soldiers who never saw a German. Their feet swelled and blackened. They could not walk. They had to be carried out on stretchers, taking up the same litter-bearer resources as men with combat wounds. Combat exhaustion, what earlier wars had called shell shock, claimed hundreds more. Men simply stopped functioning. They could not speak, could not move, and could not respond to orders. The medical system was overwhelmed before the first ceasefire was ever proposed. To understand why the American medical effort on the Kall Trail stunned the Germans, it helps to understand how the forward medical system was supposed to work. Each rifleman carried his own first aid packet containing field dressings, sulfur powder, and sulfur tablets. Within roughly half an hour of being hit, the average wounded man was treated by his company aid man, the unarmed medical department enlisted soldier, who wore the Red Cross brassard on his arm and was classified as a non-combatant under the Geneva Convention. From there, the casualty moved rearward to the battalion aid station, typically about a mile behind the rifle companies, sheltered in a cellar or dugout, then to the regimental collecting station, then to the division clearing station, 3 to 15 miles back, and from there by ambulance or tracked vehicle to the field hospitals and evacuation hospitals well behind the front. In the Hurtgen, this entire system bent and broke. The terrain made litter carries agonizing. 4 men were needed to carry one stretcher, and in the steep, root-tangled forest it could take 4 hours to move a single casualty 1 mile. The paths were often so narrow that the litter-bearers could not walk side by side, forcing them to carry the stretcher at awkward angles that sent waves of pain through the wounded man with every step. When darkness fell, the bearers could not use flashlights for fear of drawing fire. They stumbled over roots, slipped in mud, and sometimes dropped their charges. When the established litter-bearer units were overwhelmed, the 68th Medical Group drew 190 non-medical infantry replacements from a depot, issued them Red Cross brassards, gave them perhaps 2 days of training in first aid and Geneva Convention rules, and sent them into the woods as stretcher-bearers. These men had never carried a litter before. Many had never treated a wound, but they went. And visibility was a lethal problem. The standard Red Cross brassard was a cloth armband, easily missed in the mist and shadows of the forest. German troops repeatedly said they could not see the markings at night or in heavy fog. After multiple incidents of medics being fired upon, the 12th Army Group formally authorized in November 1944 the painting of large red crosses on white fields directly onto helmets. Later studies confirmed that these helmet markings were visible at far greater distances than the standard cloth brassard. Many medics also wore Red Cross tabards over their uniforms and carried Red Cross flags on sticks, waving them as they moved between positions. The principal American medical officers on the Kall Trail are not anonymous. Their names appear in after-action reports, filed within days of the events, preserved as combat interviews 75 and 76, 28th Infantry Division, in Record Group 407, Box 24032, at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. These reports became the documentary backbone of Charles B. MacDonald and Sidney T. Matthews's chapter on Schmidt in 3 Battles, published by the Office of the Chief of Military History in 1952, the key figures were Major Albert L. Berndt, the regimental surgeon of the 112th Infantry Regiment, Captain Pascal Linguiti, surgeon of the 1st Battalion, Captain Michael DeMarco, surgeon of the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Lieutenant Alfred Muglia, assistant battalion surgeon, 2nd Lieutenant Henry Morrison of the Medical Detachment, 1st Lieutenant Lloyd Johnson of Company C, 103rd Medical Battalion. And among the enlisted men, Technician 4th Grade Wheeler Walters, who served as Major Berndt's interpreter under the white flag, and Sergeant John Shedio, the senior medic who kept the evacuation vehicles running by hand pouring fuel from jerry cans into punctured gas tanks while under fire. On November 3rd, Captain Linguiti set up the 1st Battalion aid station in a basement in Kommerscheidt. Captain DeMarco placed the 3rd Battalion station first in the Vossenack Church, and then, on November 4th, in a log bunker dug into the steep hillside above the Kall Trail. The bunker was a cramped log-walled dugout cut into the hillside, less than 200 feet below the rocky outcropping where the Sherman had thrown its track. The map grid reference, recorded in the official reports, was 046316. On November 5th, German artillery struck the Kommerscheidt aid station repeatedly, killing several enlisted medics and rendering it useless. Linguiti consolidated his survivors with DeMarco's team in the trailside dugout. 2 surgeons, their remaining technicians, and 2 chaplains, Chaplain Madden and Chaplain Manis, now shared a cramped underground room with a steadily growing number of wounded men. The air inside the dugout was thick with the smell of blood, wet wool, and disinfectant. There was no running water. Light came from candles and a few battery-powered flashlights. The surgeons worked on their knees, performing emergency procedures by candlelight, debriding wounds with whatever instruments they had, injecting morphine syrettes to manage the screaming, tying off bleeders, packing open fractures. Plasma bottles hung from nails driven into the log ceiling. When the plasma ran low, they prioritized the men who had the best chance of surviving if they could be evacuated. The others were made as comfortable as possible and left to wait. That same night, the Germans cut the Kall Trail. From that moment on, the medical detachment was behind enemy lines. German troops controlled the trail above and below the dugout. The bridge at the Mestrenger Mule was in German hands. The American medics were surrounded, with a growing number of wounded, and no way to evacuate them. Collecting Company C of the 103rd Medical Battalion, the unit that was supposed to run ambulances from the trail up to the division clearing station, could not get a single vehicle through. The chain of evacuation, the fundamental architecture of American battlefield medicine, had been severed. What happened next is documented in the joint report filed by Captains Linguiti and DeMarco on November 15, 1944. During one of the jeep trips from Kommerscheidt that night, their medical personnel were attacked by German soldiers. 2 American medics were wounded, but when the Germans realized they had fired on a medical party, they apologized. They said they had not noticed the displayed Red Cross armbands in the darkness. Later that night, the main supply route was shelled, then attacked, then mined and blocked. German soldiers controlled it completely. But they made no attempt to molest the aid station, nor did they inquire as to who occupied the bunker. The Germans knew the Americans were in there. They chose to leave them alone. This was the first surprise on the Kall Trail, and it was the German surprise. They had overrun an American position and found, sitting in the middle of their own lines, a functioning battalion-level medical operation. 2 physicians, 2 medical administrative officers, multiple enlisted technicians, 2 chaplains who had refused to leave the wounded, surgical supplies, plasma, sulfur, and morphine, all of it still operating. The Geneva Convention required belligerents to respect medical facilities, but in the chaos of forest fighting, where visibility was measured in yards and men fired at shadows, adherence to those rules was far from guaranteed. Yet on the Kall Trail, the Germans left it alone. By November 7th, the dugout held about 60 wounded. By November 8th, there were more than 60 litter cases, about 25 crammed inside the bunker, and the rest laid along the trail outside, wrapped in whatever blankets could be found, sheltered only by medics holding Red Cross flags over them in the rain and snow. Wounded men lay on the frozen ground, shivering, and waiting for treatment or evacuation that might never come. The Linguiti DeMarco report describes that night with a restraint that makes the horror more vivid, not less. Wounded came to them in great numbers. They had no facilities. About 25 patients were crowded into the bunker, and the rest had to be left along the roadside. German medics guided and in some cases carried American wounded to the aid station. Even German riflemen threw aside their rifles to give them a hand. Artillery shells from both sides fell all over the area, but none hit the medical party. The surgeons wrote that they were certain the Germans took special precautions to avoid hitting them. That observation, written by a United States Army battalion surgeon within 72 hours of the event, is the documentary heart of this entire story. The first direct contact between the two sides came on November 7th at the Mestrenger Mule Bridge. 3 unarmed American litter bearers, including Sergeant Provencher of Company M, 112th Infantry, approached the German lines without a formal flag of truce. A German sentry challenged them. He spoke no English. Provencher spoke no German. Provencher tried French. The German became receptive. Cigarettes were offered and accepted. From that point until the end of the truces, American cigarettes for the Germans and German army bread for the Americans became the unofficial currency of the gorge. The Germans let the litter-bearers pass with their wounded. The second contact was Major Berndt on November 9th. Berndt walked down the Kall Trail with Technician Wolters carrying a white flag. He met a German lieutenant and 6 soldiers. As they spoke, the cries of a wounded American soldier rose from across the river. 2 American medics asked permission to fetch water. Berndt told them to try to bring the wounded man back instead. Berndt was offered a German evacuation of the dugout's casualties, but he declined, fearing a trick. As the American hospital train, 2 trucks and a leaking cargo carrier began limping up the trail with Sergeant Shedio refueling the vehicles by hand from jerry cans, another German patrol stopped it. They checked the Geneva Convention identity cards of every American medic, and then they waved them through. The German doctor, whose name became permanently attached to what veterans of the 28th Division later called the miracle of the Hurtgen forest, was Hauptmann Gunter Stuttgen. Born on January 23, 1919, in Düsseldorf, Stuttgen was just 25 years old, in November 1944. He had passed his German state medical examination in 1943 and was serving as the regimental medical officer of the 1056th Infantry Regiment, 89th Infantry Division, the unit commanded by Colonel Eberhard Rosler that had been blocking the Americans on the Monschau front since September. The negotiations for a broader ceasefire were described after the war by First Lieutenant Heinz Münster, commander of the 14th Company, 1056th Infantry Regiment, 89th Infantry Division. According to Münster, Colonel Rosler authorized Stuttgen to negotiate directly with the Americans. Stuttgen, a medic, and Münster himself, all identified by Red Cross signs on chest and back, wearing white armbands and carrying no weapons, walked on foot through the forest toward the Mestrenger Mule. They approached and entered the American defensive positions. The Americans were surprised and kept them under close guard. After a brief conversation, the American unit leader appeared and greeted them in German. He agreed immediately to discuss the proposal at the German command post in the mill. What they found between the lines was worse than anticipated. Between deserted and destroyed tanks lay dead and wounded from both sides. Friend and foe hid in their foxholes, soaked through, hungry and demoralized. The negotiations were repeatedly interrupted by artillery fire from both sides. Münster recalled the entire delegation diving into the cellar of the mill for shelter. But for periods on November 7th, 9th and 12th, fighting in the gorge effectively stopped to allow medics to work. During those truces, the gorge took on a surreal quality. Men who had been trying to kill each other hours earlier now stood a few yards apart, watching as stretcher-bearers from both armies moved through the wreckage. Knocked-out Sherman tanks sat in the streambed with their hatches open, their crews long dead or evacuated. German soldiers stood in small groups, smoking American cigarettes. American medics walked past German machine gun positions without being challenged. The sounds of the gorge during those truces were not the sounds of war. They were the sounds of boots in mud, of low voices calling out casualty counts, of stretcher poles scraping against rocks, and of wounded men groaning as they were lifted and carried toward aid they had not expected to receive. Hundreds of wounded on both sides reached treatment because of those pauses in the killing. The historical record points to several specific reasons why the German soldiers in the Kall Gorge reacted with such surprise, and in many cases, active assistance. First, every documented German account describes the American medics approaching their lines completely unarmed. Berndt and Wolters carried no weapons. Provencher's litter party carried nothing. The medics in the dugout had no weapons at all. Linguiti and DeMarco went further. They disarmed the rifle stragglers who took shelter in their bunker, telling them that any armed man under the Red Cross flag would compromise the Geneva Convention protection of every wounded soldier in the station. That meticulous adherence to the rules of war, at a moment when capture in a forest that no one controlled was practically a death sentence, registered deeply with the German troops. Second, the sheer scale of the medical operation surprised the Germans. They had pushed the Americans across the river. By every German measure, the trail belonged to the 89th Infantry Division. Yet in the middle of their own territory, they found a fully functioning American medical facility with 2 surgeons, 2 administrative officers, chaplains, and a full complement of surgical supplies. Third, the Americans insisted on treating and evacuating German wounded too. During the truces, American medical jeeps that had room carried German litter cases up to the ambulance loading point at Vossenack. American medical supplies that were not needed were left at the dugout for German use. Munster's report notes that during the ceasefires, German riflemen climbed into knocked-out American Sherman tanks to scavenge food and cigarettes and were not fired upon. Fourth, the visibility issue played a direct role in shaping the truces. The Germans repeatedly told the American medics that they shot at everything at night but would let the Red Cross pass during the day. Several Americans had been hit at night because the standard brassard could not be seen. The daylight truces were not merely gentlemen's agreements. They were practical recognitions that nighttime fighting along the trail had been killing aid men who could not be identified. The Kall Trail was not the only place in the Hurtgen where this happened. The wider pattern of German conduct toward medics in the forest, particularly among the older Wehrmacht regulars of the 275th, 89th, and 353rd Infantry Divisions, was generally scrupulous. During a counterattack at Frenzerburg Castle on the northern edge of the Hurtgen, the 47th Infantry of the 9th Division and the German defenders observed a 3-hour truce so that a German ambulance could remove 30 severely wounded soldiers. In a separate incident, the Germans captured an aidman of the 22nd Infantry, 4th Division, put him to work caring for American casualties, and then employed him alongside a German medical soldier to carry the wounded Americans back toward their own lines while both sides held fire. And then there is the story of Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld, which occurred less than 10 miles north of the Kall on November 12, 1944. Lengfeld commanded the 2nd Company, Fusilier Battalion, 275, of the 275th Infantry Division. He was 23 years old, a young officer who had earned the respect of his men through competence and decency. When he heard a wounded American soldier calling for help from inside a minefield the Germans had named the Wild Sow, a dense patch of forest laced with anti-personnel mines and tripwires, he ordered his machine gunner not to fire at any approaching American medics. He waited. Hours passed. No American rescue party appeared. The wounded man kept calling. Finally, Lengfeld could not stand it any longer. He gathered his own medics, marked them with Red Cross flags, and led them into the minefield to bring the American out himself. He stepped on an anti-personnel mine. The blast tore through his legs. His medics pulled him out and carried him to the German main aid station at Freutzheim, but the wounds were too severe. He died the same day. The American soldier he had tried to save was never identified in the surviving records. On October 7, 1994, veterans of the American 22nd Infantry Regiment returned to the Hurtgen and dedicated a bronze monument to Lengfeld at the Hurtgen German War Cemetery. It is the only known monument placed by American soldiers in a German military cemetery to honor an enemy. The inscription reads, "No man hath greater love than he who layeth down his life for his enemy." These were not isolated incidents. They were part of the moral fabric of the forest in November 1944, and the Kall Trail truces fit inside that fabric. The end of the aid station ordeal came in stages. On the morning of November 9th, Major Bernt's white flag negotiations succeeded in arranging a partial evacuation. 2.5-ton trucks and a weasel-tracked vehicle were loaded with the most serious cases. Lieutenant Morrison and Sergeant Shedio set off ahead to find ambulances. The trucks were stopped further up the trail by knocked-out armor and a fresh German unit that had not been part of the truce. Captain DeMarco walked up to negotiate. The Germans permitted only the seriously wounded and medical personnel to pass. Lightly wounded men would be taken prisoner. 8 ambulances eventually arrived from the rear. The Germans checked each medic's Geneva Convention identity card before allowing them through. On November 10th, the German unit holding the upper trail tried to impose new conditions. They demanded the surrender of all surrounding American troops and the return of all German wounded who had already been evacuated. While negotiations continued, artillery from both sides opened fire. The medics returned to the bunker and waited. On November 11th, a final truce was negotiated with the German medical officer at the foot of the hill. The Linguiti de Marco report carefully notes that this German doctor had no contact with the German soldiers at the top of the hill, whose prisoners the Americans had been. The German request was to recover their own dead first. American artillery refused to recognize the lull. German artillery answered by shelling Vossenac, but the American medics walked their wounded out anyway and rejoined the 109th Infantry's lines. The final group of American casualties came out on November 11, 1944. The 28th Division began its withdrawal from the line on November 13. Major Bernst's report on medical evacuation was filed 3 days later. The surgeons of the 112th Infantry offered 10 lessons learned from the ordeal. German personnel respected the Geneva Convention and cooperated with American medical personnel. American medical personnel are in dire need of larger and more visible Red Cross markings. No evacuation of wounded should be attempted at night across enemy lines. The Germans shoot at everything at night, but will let the Red Cross pass during the day. And the problem of medical evacuation is identical to the maintenance of a supply route. The failure of one makes the other almost impossible. These observations went forward to the division surgeon and ultimately shaped the helmet marking policy and Geneva Convention discipline of the entire United States First Army for the remainder of the war. The 28th Infantry Division was sent to a quiet sector in the Ardennes to rebuild. The division had lost so many men that entire companies had to be reconstituted from scratch. Replacements arrived from training depots, young men who had never seen combat, and they were folded into units whose surviving veterans carried the hollow-eyed look of men who had seen too much in the forest. The quiet sector was supposed to give them time to integrate, to train, to recover some semblance of combat effectiveness. On December 16, 1944, the very day the Battle of Hurtgen Forest is conventionally said to have ended, the Germans launched their massive offensive through the Ardennes, and the Bloody Bucket Division, still recovering from its losses in the Kall Gorge, was struck again at the start of the Battle of the Bulge. The 28th Division fought hard, buying critical time for the Allied defence along the roads leading to Bastogne, but it was mauled once more. Colonel Karl Petersen, commander of the 112th Infantry, was relieved during the Kall battle and held no further regimental command in combat. General Cotter remained in command of the 28th Division until it was inactivated after the war. He died in 1971. The Kall Trail itself was never retaken by the 28th Division. Schmidt and the Schwammenauel Dam finally fell to the 78th Infantry Division in February 1945, though the 78th approached from a different direction entirely. First Lieutenant Turney Leonard's posthumous Medal of Honor was presented to his mother by Major General Walton Walker in Dallas on October 24, 1945. His body was recovered in November 1949 from the caved-in dugout near Kommerscheidt. His Texas A&M class ring, found by a German civilian named Alfred Hutmacher and returned decades later through his son-in-law, German Army Captain Volker Lossner, is displayed today at the Sam Houston Sanders Corps of Cadets Center at Texas A&M University. Gunter Stuttgen survived the war. Toward its very end, assigned to a different sector, he surrendered an entire German field hospital to advancing Allied forces without firing a shot. For this act, a German military court sentenced him to death in absentia. The sentence was never carried out. After the war ended, Stuttgen returned to medicine with the same dedication he had shown in the Kall Gorge. He completed his postdoctoral research, earned his habilitation, and rose through the ranks of German academic dermatology. He published hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. He never spoke publicly about the Hurtgen until the 1990s, when American veterans of the 28th Division set out to find the German doctor their men remembered from the gorge. They found him in Berlin, by then one of Germany's most distinguished dermatologists. He had led the dermatology clinic at the Free University of Berlin's Rudolf Virchow Hospital from 1968 to 1988, and is credited with foundational research on the use of vitamin A and retinoids in dermatological treatment. On November 12, 1996, in a formal ceremony at the state capitol in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the home state of the 28th Division, Stuttgen was honored by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for his act of humanity toward the Keystone Division's men. He gave perhaps the most quoted remark of the entire engagement in an interview with the German newspaper Die Welt on June 23, 2001. "We had respect for each other," he said. the respect that only soldiers can have for each other who know the horror of war. Stuttgen died in Berlin on October 21, 2003. He is one of only 2 German soldiers from the Hurtgen battle publicly honored after the war by their former American enemies. The other is Friedrich Lengfeld. On November 7, 2004, on the 60th anniversary of the first Kall Trail ceasefire, sculptor Michael Pohlmann of Wettweiss unveiled his Dolomite sculpture on the rebuilt stone bridge over the Kall near the Mestringer Mule. The work is called A Time for Healing. Pohlmann said he did not want to create a heroic memorial. Nothing theatrical, no pathos. A small information plaque in German and English stands beside it. The original painting of the same name hangs in the 28th Division Shrine at the Pennsylvania Military Museum in Boalsburg. A replica is on permanent display at the Museum Hurtgenwald, 1944, und am Frieden in Wassenach. Today, the Kall Trail is again what it was before the battle, a logging path in the woods. The crumbled foundation of the dugout where Linguiti and DeMarco worked is still there, difficult to find under decades of undergrowth. The rocky outcropping still bears scars where American engineers blasted it wider for Flaig's Shermans. The Mestringer Mule is now a restaurant. From the bridge, a hiker can climb the same path the wounded were carried up by jeep, by weasel, on the backs of American medics, and on at least one documented occasion by a German rifleman who put down his weapon and lifted the other end of a United States Army litter. The German soldiers in the Kall Gorge were not stunned because they had never encountered brave medics before. They were stunned because, in the worst week of one of the most catastrophic American operations of the war, with their own armor and infantry having shattered 3 American battalions and trapped more than 60 litter cases on a single trail in the forest, the Americans kept walking toward them, unarmed. They carried Red Cross flags. They asked for water from a river the Germans controlled, and most astonishingly to the men watching them, they insisted on bringing the German wounded back too. The reports filed within days of the battle by the men who were there agree on one thing. Inside that gorge, for a few days in November 1944, the 2 armies did not behave the way either side's propaganda said they would. That is what the painting at the 28th Division Shrine in the Pennsylvania Military Museum is called, A Time for Healing. And that is why the Germans were stunned when American medics crossed the Kall under fire.